Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler and today we're going to talk about the second book in the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever by Stephen R. Donaldson. Last time we talked about the first part, The Wounded Land, and today we're going to talk about the second volume in this series, which is called The One Tree. And the next video will be dedicated to the third part, White Gold Wielder. Now, Donaldson never planned to write a sequel to the first trilogy, but because it was so successful, it was a bestseller, and in the late 70s, his publisher approached him again and again for a sequel, and finally Donaldson gave in, so to speak, and he wrote a sequel. But I don't think he really wanted to, and you can see it in the first volume. When you have a look at the characters, that most of them are fairly flat, except for the main character, Thomas Covenant, and the main female protagonist, Lyndon Avery, who also comes from our world to the land with Covenant. Now, the strength of these books is certainly the main character, Thomas Covenant himself, because of his illness. He's a leper, which brings, of course, a lot of problems, also socially, psychologically. He's left by his wife because she's afraid for herself and for their child, and he's shunned by the society he lives in the small town in the US. And when he comes to the land, everything changes for him. He's miraculously healed by kind of magic clay, and he's not able to cope with this new strange situation. And this is the basis for the story in the first Chronicles. And in the second Chronicles, Thomas Covenant still has his problems, although 10 years have passed. And we are introduced to another character, Lyndon Avery, a woman from our world, who is a doctor and who has her own problems. And we will look into these two characters in a moment. And that's, I would say, is, for me at least, the greatest reward of reading these books, that these characters are very, very interesting. They are very complex, much more complex than you're used to in a fantasy story. So what's the story in this second part of the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant? Thomas Covenant and Lyndon Avery leave the land. They set out to find the one tree from which wood was taken to make the staff of law thousands of years ago. And this staff of law could be used to canalize the magic inherent in the land called earth power. And the staff of law was destroyed in the first Chronicles, and Thomas Covenant wants to make a new staff and use it to defeat his enemy, Lord Foul, who is the Dark Lord of the series. And he also wants to use it to send Lyndon Avery back to our world to save him, because she's a doctor and Thomas Covenant was badly wounded in our world right before he came to the land at the beginning of The Wounded Land, the first part in the series. Lyndon Avery has her own aims. She's still deeply troubled because of the death of her parents some years earlier, and the leader of the new lords, Gibbon, who is possessed by a demon, has used these problems of Lyndon Avery to his advantage when he was taking Lyndon captive, and he has greatly strengthened these feelings of guilt that she has. And the aim was apparently to persuade her to make Covenant give up his magic ring to her. And the reason for this is that Lord Foul wants the ring to use the magic, the wild magic in Thomas Covenant's wedding ring, white gold ring, to break free of his prison, which is this fantasy world, to start his war on the creator of this world, who appears a few times in our world, concealed as a beggar in the first Chronicles. He also appears at the beginning of the second Chronicles, where he talks to Lyndon, not to Covenant himself. It's a fairly complex story, a bit confusing, But as I remember when I read this, the first Chronicles, when I was 14 years old, I enjoyed the second volume the most. There were a lot of things happening. It was a story about the war. Thomas Covenant's character got even more interesting in the second volume than in the first one. And we will now look into the second book in the second Chronicles and delve into a few of its topics. Covenant fears his own power, the wild magic, but also that Lord Fowl will get hold of it. He is still struggling with his position as an outsider because of his leprosy, and with his feelings of guilt because of his past crimes in the land. Strangely, he is now able to control the magic from his ring, which must mean that it is no longer wild. Lyndon's personality remained unclear in the first volume in the second Chronicles, but here her personality has more depth. Her longing for independence as well as for intimacy is something that we've all experienced. She's struggling with her traumatic experiences from the first volume, as well as with her memories of the violent deaths of her parents. The descriptions of Lyndon's relationship with her father and his suicide seem somewhat exaggerated, but that to her mother is intriguing and could have been expanded upon. Covenant's ex-wife Joan, who had returned to Covenant in the first volume, plays no part in Covenant's thoughts and feelings, not even when he and Lyndon become close, and his leprosy too has lost much of its importance. He is not impotent anymore. He makes no body checks, and his illness does not break out anew when he is wounded, which is strange, since he hasn't been healed from it. There is no magic clay anymore. Lyndon too doesn't relate her experiences in the land to her life in the real world, except for the memories of the deaths of her parents. Thus Donaldson fails to say something relevant about our own world through his story, in spite of Covenant's pondering whether Lord Fowl, who is called the Despiser, may be Covenant himself. Perhaps the road from doubting to despising is not that long after all. And why are the Haruchai still so similar to the former blood god, 3,500 years after Covenant's last visit to the land? They still have no personality, almost no feelings, and no other wish than that to serve the people of their choosing until death. One of the strengths of the first Chronicles was the extreme contrast between the all-too-human Covenant and the unhuman, superhuman Banner, Covenant's personal Haruchai bodyguard. In the second Chronicles, the Haruchai remain in the background throughout the story, and because they do nothing except fighting and keeping silent, they are not very interesting, although Covenant has his own personal bodyguard in this story as well, who is even called Bryn. But not just the Haruchai remain anonymous in the book. Also Vane and Findale, two very unrealistic characters who do almost nothing on these almost 500 pages, as well as most of the giants who join the group. And since they have no personality, you forget them at once after having put the book aside. The sole exception apart from Covenant and Lyndon are possibly Pitchwife and the First, a very unlikely couple consisting of a disabled giant and his warrior girlfriend, the leader of the group. Like in the first volume, there is no erotic tension at all. Lyndon's Haruchai bodyguard, Kale, carries her up some stairs and she sits in front of him in the saddle. During a banquet, she is being surrounded by men who take an interest in her, and the Haruchai are likewise surrounded by curious women. Later she and Kale sleep in the same bed, since there are only single rooms. All this is just mentioned, and no one seems to feel anything about it whatsoever, neither positive nor negative. Like the other travelers, Linden too becomes more and more dirty during the journey, but she has no feelings of disgust nor of shame. Generally, she resembles a man throughout the books, and it remains unclear why Covenant is important to her. The bringing back of Covenant's spirit is well described, but the scene is too short. There are a few beautiful metaphors in the book. Linden's hands shiver like injured birds, we are told, and when she feels insecure, it says that lucidity is dripping from her thoughts, like the sweat that makes the hair at her temples look darker. Donaldson uses the perspective of the all-knowing storyteller. He explains Covenant's complex and highly emotional state to the reader, instead of letting the reader experience it. Linden recognizes a few things in the fantasy world which she couldn't possibly be familiar with, like the different kinds of ancient warships. Instead of describing her impressions in this scene, Donaldson simply lists what she sees. There are long passages in the book where not much happens, and the dialogues often feel too long and not very realistic. It's the way people talk to each other in books. Sometimes there is too little description. The sea monster, for example, remains faceless. A few things repeat themselves, like Linden's craving for power and the shame that follows. But we are never told why she wants power. In the dialogues, some things are just said to inform the reader. Either the recipient already knows, or he cannot understand what is being said. Other things the reader knows already. Donaldson speaks of the group as the Questers, which sounds rather ridiculous. It would have been enough to tell the story partly from Covenant's perspective and partly from Linden's, without an all-knowing storyteller. That way the story would have felt much more natural. Peter Jackson once said in an interview about Star Wars that after so many years you don't really remember the special effects in the very first Star Wars movie, just the characters. It's a pity Donaldson didn't have the opportunity to watch that interview before writing his second Chronicles.